Hello and welcome to another Ammach project Archives. In this episode, we're still with the interview series and we will meet Resh Nawar. Resh is a young man who, at 26 years old, and I think maybe even before that, maybe 25, began to have some experiences. A lot of sightings that were induced by himself, one or two events that were not consciously derived, and then he had some very strange, let's say, out of body experiences, but there's more to it than that. He had an entanglement with a grey on that other level of consciousness. And I think you're going to find this interview quite interesting. It's a little bit different. So enjoy.
And welcome to another Ammach interview. And we are with Resh Nawar. I'm going to ask Resh to tell you a little bit more about himself.
Well, I was at Southampton University and I was studying for a degree in aerospace and astronautical engineering because I wanted to be an airline pilot initially, but kind of lost my way a little bit and went an alternative route, but came out with, after a fairly stressful period, not the qualifications I wanted, but good qualifications nonetheless.
So it's interesting though, because you began having experiences and that studying gave you some points of reference.
Craft or otherwise?
Yes, let's talk about the craft.
Okay, there's a little bit of a backstory to that, but the first, let's say, convincing experience happened last August during the Perseid meteorite shower.
Now we're talking 2010.
2010.
Yeah.
And I'd gone out in my garden with the intention of looking for craft. And as you said, because of my degree, I had a fairly good understanding of what should and shouldn't be in the nighttime sky.
Yeah, so you could tell between satellites and planes and...
Yep, absolutely. And I saw all the relevant nighttime traffic and didn't think much of it. 5 minutes into the process, this great big white crisp teardrop shaped, the best thing to say is craft really, there's no other word for it, just materialised into space-time.
I mean, did it seem to sort of just pop out of the space as opposed to travel toward you?
Yeah, it stayed at a set distance, but it materialised into sort of space-time, travelled across the sky completely silently for a couple of seconds and then dematerialised. But the thing that stood out for me that night was, because it was the meteorite shower and I hadn't been out in one of those before, and I'd wanted to see that anyway.
So you'd seen some of these?
I'd seen the meteorites and I'd seen the big ones and I knew what they looked like, and they had a great big white tail and they made a very distinct noise. This was 30 times bigger than the biggest meteorite I'd seen that night. It was completely silent.
Can you give us a sort of size idea? Have you got a...
Yes.
I know you did some pictures for us. Let's have a little
There's
look.
a little size comparison there as well.
So this would be the meteorite?
That would be the largest.
And so it was, okay, so this is on its side, the teardrop. And just tell us what this bit in the middle is.
I'd love to be able to tell you for certain exactly what it was. It was a big white teardrop with a red glowing ball in the middle with a sort of faint orange tinge on the outside. And there was something else inside that. If I was to hazard a guess, I didn't have my glasses on that night, but it looked like something with its hand held up, but obviously...
Oh, really?
Yeah. I wouldn't like to sort of say for certain, but...
So I noticed you've got here, you could hear some kind of disintegrating sounds of the meteor coming into the atmosphere there.
Yeah, I was in my back garden when I was doing this.
So that's your vision, your line of vision?
So that's line of sight, so it's just sort of the 45-degree angle, directly in my line of sight. I didn't have to look anywhere for it, right there, and then went across the sky.
So it kind of hovered in your eye line for a moment or two?
Moments or two, and then traced across the sky for a few seconds.
So it almost sounds like it was acknowledging you. Is that what you felt?
Well, that's what I hoped. Yeah, that was the point of me being out there that night. So.
And were there any feelings with that? Were there any sort of sensations or lights or any sense of communication?
Oh, I'd love to say that I had that wonderful sense of and pleasure and love. It was just a wonderful experience, a very euphoric sense of self and a lovely bit of an adrenaline rush. But unfortunately, no voices or anything or communication like that, no.
And so just let's back up a bit and tell us all why you did that in the first place.
Well, in my last year of university, last January 2010, started with a fairly difficult experience. It took me a long time to really figure out what was going on because I'd never had anything like that before. I had sleep paralysis every now and again, but so much so that I know what it is when I'm having it. You know, I'm paralysed in my body. It's an incredibly terrifying experience. It's never fun. Say that I had sleep paralysis just to sort of draw a comparison in this particular experience. Okay. And on this particular night in January, I was asleep in bed, and I knew that I hadn't been asleep for very long. And I was woken up, and I knew straight away that I'd been woken up, that it was obvious, you know, it wasn't a dream state. And what happened was that I found myself being pulled very sharply out of my bed by my ankles over the foot of the bed, and ended up in a heap on the floor.
So this is an out-of-body experience at this point?
I didn't know at that point, but it turned out that it was.
So you couldn't actually distinguish at that point?
No, but it was immediately very different because there was a lot of very vivid movement, and the other thing was that there was no sense of fear and there was no real emotion at all. Just a very distinct sense of, well, this is really unusual and I've got to do something about this.
And you're in a heap on the floor?
I'm in a heap on the floor, and I can't see any of my limbs, and I still can't figure out what's going on at the moment, but I know that I'm by my desk. At this point, after spending 20 or 30 seconds or so on the floor, I was brought up to the ceiling, or floated to the ceiling, I can't say for certain.
But you sort of found yourself
I found myself
floating.
You know, sort of wafting across the ceiling. If I'd been in my body, I would have said that my arms and legs were sort of hanging down, like by my back. I was constantly analysing everything, and eventually looked at my bed and saw myself in my body, so I thought, well, that's an out-of-body experience right there, isn't it? And it wasn't frightening, it was just very interesting. Like I said, I'd never had anything like that before. After a while on the ceiling, I was brought down to the floor, where I began struggling with whatever had pulled me out of my body.
So when you said you were brought down, was it as if something was bringing you down, or?
Yeah, that time it felt as if I was being brought down to the floor. It's kind of difficult to describe. It was more forceful than being brought up. But the silly thing is, I saw my shoes and my shoe rack, I saw my cutlery under the bed, and I was still analysing everything at this point. Still the sense of, well, I didn't ask for this, so I'm going to do something about it, but no terror, no fear.
And had you seen anything else by this point?
Not at this point, but I knew that as best as I could describe, it had me in a headlock. It was behind me, trying to pin me down to something. I don't know what it was. Eventually, after struggling for a few minutes with this thing, the experience ended when I managed to, and you know, bearing in mind I've never had an experience like this, I hadn't ever heard of astral bodies or you know, this kind of thing before. I couldn't tell you how my appendages worked. I managed to grab this thing by the head.
So did that feel very physical to you?
It felt completely tangible. Yep, I could feel my astral fingers, if you like, depressing into the top of its head, and I saw it at that point. As soon as I made contact with it, I saw it, and it was half of a small grey head, almond eye, and this is the picture.
So that would be, you know, again what you would see, isn't it? Just
yeah, sort of looking out the back. As soon as I saw that,
smaller size, or?
It felt very small, maximum 4 feet.
So how did this develop? So you're struggling, and you turn around, you've got your hands on its head.
I only saw it for a second at most. As soon as I made contact with it, the experience ended. There was a great whooshing sensation. I sat bolt upright in my bed. Again, no sense of fear. I just felt very sheepish. I was like, this hasn't happened to me before, and this is kind of strange.
So was there any communication between you and this the being at the time?
No, it all felt very clinical.
So you had no idea what it was doing with you, what you were expected to do?
No, there were no thoughts or voices.
And did you have any marks that you noticed on yourself after the altercation?
No, I didn't, no. But I knocked on because I was in a bedsit for my last year at university, I knocked on the neighbour's door and asked her if she'd heard anything, and she said no, and I knocked on the guy opposite me, and no. But it was such a real, tangible experience, and the point being, I knew that I'd been woken up. You know, I was not asleep anymore.
And after you'd sat bolt upright in your bed, did you then feel fear, or were you pretty calm?
No, I was quite happy to go to bed, which was strange in light of the circumstances. Yeah. But a couple of weeks later, having thought about it and remembered every aspect of it, the same thing happened again. However, this time, for want of a better phrase, I felt sedated and not in control, or whereas, you know, I managed
maybe like
to,
coming out of an anaesthetic, something like that.
Whereas the first time I'd been able to struggle with the thing, this time it was a much slower experience. I was pulled over the side of the bed
rather than sort of yanked.
Rather than abruptly yanked out the foot of the bed. and whatever had done it the first time had learned, yeah, and there were more of them. But that, as I said, it was so, even though it was very real and it was very tangible, I felt sedated. You know, I felt not in control of that one. I couldn't have been in control if I'd wanted to be.
And could you see quite clearly around you who and what?
I could see my bedroom very distinctly, and I could feel, which is an incredibly annoying thing to say for someone who's studied the science that I had. I could feel more of them, and a very, very brief recollection of lights and not being in my room, but nothing that I would hold up in a court of law. That was pretty much where it ended.
Any missing time from that?
No missing time,
No.
but as with the first experience, when the experience ended, there was this whooshing feeling,
sound,
and
feeling, yeah.
very, very quick, straight back in the bed again.
And then were you sitting bolt upright again with that?
I woke straight up. Well, not woke, straight up. Yeah.
And how did you feel then? How long did it take for you to come back to yourself from this drugged feeling?
A few minutes. It was strange. It didn't feel normal. There was no fear. It was just the first time it happened, it was a novelty. A very unusual experience, but I had an inkling what it might be. The second time, because it happened for the second time, there was a lot more apprehension, and I really wanted to find out more about it and find answers to a lot of questions that I then decided to ask myself.
Take us back to childhood and your first memory.
Unlike other experiences, I haven't had any relationship with beings from childhood as far as I know. But I have had sleep paralysis every now and again, but like I said, it's a very distinct experience. The only recollection of anything with relevance to these experiences was a particular night when I was 13, 14, waking up and seeing a very small outline of a being stood by the side of my bed a little bit further
And would you
off.
recognise that as the being that you saw, that you've already talked about?
I would recognise it as being the same height, same build, but this time, rather than having the sheer terror, there was no terror, but an incredibly intense, buzzing, vibratory sensation. It was through every cell, every fibre, and I was rolled around a couple of times around my central axis, so I'm sort of
A bit like being
lying
on a
in bed.
spit.
Yeah, a bit like being on a spit, yeah,
Right.
still in the bed.
But you could feel something pushing you, or
It was something acting at a distance. There were no hands sort of, rolling me over.
Yeah.
At that
Or
time, I'd never really looked into the UFO phenomenon.
No, well, you're 13, aren't
Yeah,
you? Yeah.
I didn't really associate anything other than a bad dream. But now, looking back at it,
Has your family had any experiences at all?
not that I know of. It's been difficult talking to my family. I have to choose those wisely to talk to about,
Yeah.
but they haven't told me anything like that, no.
And you're 26 now, so so you've had quite a few experiences then. They began again
Just last year.
So tell us a little bit more about some of the other sightings that you've had.
The exciting journey started after the second experience last year in January. It was so unusual, it was so out of the norm for me. With what I'd seen and what I'd felt, I kind of knew exactly which route to take, and I pursued the UFO thing quite passionately, but I was having a very stressful time at university in my last year anyway, and I like to do things differently, and I decided to set myself a few questions that I thought would give me some good answers and good insight into how the world works, because the world is going slightly crazy at the moment. And there are a lot.
Can you tell us what these questions are? Because they set you on a particular path of exploration, didn't they?
Absolutely. Well, there were 5 questions. What is reality? Which is a fairly big one. What am I? Who am I? Is there life after death? And are we alone in the universe? And the first one I decided to start with was, well, the first 2 were, what is reality and what am I? And with my background, although we didn't study physics tremendously within the scope of the degree, we did touch on it, so I had a good inkling where to go, and I started with the atom, because everything's made of atoms and it seemed like a good place to start. So I went back and did a little bit of research on that, and I realised that I'd forgotten all about my A-level education and one very important particular part of it, part of the physics A-level, which was the double slit experiment and called duality. And I spent a little time looking into that, and it immediately struck a chord, and the thing that made sense the most was that the observer does collapse the wave function, and everything you see you are creating, and you are, whatever it is that you are, is fundamentally connected with everything around you. Well, at that point, I hadn't begun to look too much into the UFO thing. I wanted to sort of build up this picture of reality first before I figured anything else out. But the conclusions were that we're living in a field of consciousness, but this consciousness can also extend outside of space-time, and information loops back in and out again. And wonderful things started happening as soon as I began to realise that and focused on it. I mean, synchronicity just went haywire.
That's a really common element or facet. It's really interesting that synchronization seems to go crazy.
I mean, the bizarre thing was that you get coincidences in your life, don't you? And several were happening every day with such unbelievable... I was getting very upset with the state of the world anyway, and I was looking for information all over the place about whether this was true or whether that was true. And I really wanted an unbiased source of news with everything that I was looking into at the time, which was oil and geopolitics and this kind of thing, but free from corporatocracy and the grip that has over the media. And I had a real desire to find that, and I was looking at my computer, I couldn't find anything. 5 minutes later I went down to university, and some bloke that I'd never met just came up to me and said, "Do you want to read this magazine?" And it was exactly everything that I'd been looking for. Every page was everything that I'd been looking for that day. Another thing was I wanted to get back into skating, and I didn't have any money for skates, and I desperately wanted some. I was like, where am I going to get some skates? And I'd only focused on it for about a day. The next day, a friend that I hadn't heard from in ages and moved to Germany for 4 years got on the internet and said, "Resh, do you want a pair of skates?" This kind of thing.
Yeah.
And it's a skill that I think can be developed and practiced and be very, very beneficial. At that point, I couldn't prove it either way. I couldn't sort of go to my lecturers and say, well, I've got this wonderful theory, which, as it turns out, a lot of quantum physicists have now. But it just felt comfortable and nice things were happening. I then started to look into the UFO phenomenon, the ET phenomenon, and found out about the Disclosure Project and the witnesses within it.
Did you find that helpful?
It was very helpful. There were so many people from so many different areas. But the nice thing about it was I like empiricism, I like data, and I like credibility. And these people were easy to prove, and they had their credentials. But there was one person in particular, I think it was Clifford Stone, that mentioned something about these craft that they use being conscious, and rather than using radio waves or any other form of communication, they use very sophisticated electrical systems that interface directly with consciousness. So if one of them gets left behind, all they have to do is think, well, the bugger have you gone, come back, they come pick me up. So I thought, well, that's a good way of testing it. But I didn't do anything for a few months because I had to revise for my exams, and I needed to forget about all that stuff and just focus. So I got through my exams and I got my qualifications and gave it a break for the summer. The real experiences, the best experiences, happened in August. As I said a while ago, it was during the Perseid 2010, or September. And I'd gone out that night just because I'd wanted to see the shower, and I'd set the table out in the back garden, and I made myself a cup of tea, and I laid out on the table and just sort of stared at the stars and saw all sorts of meteorites, the hair-like wisps, and they were completely silent, and big thick-headed ones that made a noise tearing like paper, and it was lovely. But about after half an hour, I decided to try and communicate. Having done my research, I knew that people were starting to do this anyway, and it was through coherent thought. But having never had a teacher or anyone tell me exactly how to do this, and I wasn't comfortable enough or confident enough just to do it by thought, I talked to the stars. I had a conversation with the stars. The way that I did it was to imagine that someone was there, and I started that night with an opening statement, which I used on all the other experiences I had, which was, "Hey guys, it's Resh. Whoever you are, whatever you look like, I hope all is well with you and all is well in your world." And I wanted to see something spectacular, and I kept asking for something incontrovertible, obvious. And in my mind, I kind of wanted to see a craft come in at several thousand miles an hour and do a 90-degree turn, something that current conventional public sector physics doesn't allow. So that's what I was looking for anyway. And I saw all the regular nighttime traffic and saw satellites, which looked like UFOs to the untrained eye. But I was looking for anything that moved in the sky. A little while into it, I saw what I thought was a satellite move into my field of view. So I didn't pay any attention to being hooded. But it moved into my field of view, direct line of sight again, and flashed very brightly twice to about the size of the North Star in the sky. So it looked like a satellite, like a very, very faint distant star. It swelled up to something about the same brightness and size as the North Star in the sky. Very brilliant white. And I asked it to flash again, and it moved off, and it flashed again and moved off in a slightly different direction. And I'm by no means a brilliant expert on all things satellite, but I can tell you that unless you're lucky enough to witness a programmed change or a black project satellite, they don't do that. But it wasn't the proof that I was looking for, but it was a very nice coincidence, big buzz of adrenaline. I was fairly happy that night. So I went out the second night, and whereas the first night it had taken 10-15 minutes for anything to happen, within a couple of minutes something flashed off to my left, and I apologised for not being able to see it. It moved into my line of sight again, flashed a few times, and then went off. Because I was going at it in such a way that I was looking for conclusive proof that I could write down, that I could then take to...
Sort of document?
Yeah, exactly.
Did you have a camera there or anything?
I didn't, but there's another story about that. And it's frustrating as well, and it always is. It wasn't exactly what I'd been looking for, and I knew that if I'd told someone about that, they'd probably say, oh, it's just a satellite, or it's just this, that and the other. And up until that point, I'd be perfectly willing to concede that, yeah, okay, if you can prove exactly what that was, fine. About 5 minutes later, again directly in line of sight over my garden fence, about 45 degrees up in the sky, it was this great big white crisp teardrop materialising into existence and then going across the sky for a few seconds and dematerialising. But it was so different to anything that I'd seen before, and I knew that it wasn't a meteorite. If it had been a meteorite that big, Weymouth wouldn't be there anymore. And it was completely silent, But it was great, and I was almost all the way there to believing, well, that's what I saw, but I was fairly convinced by it. Yeah, no, it just faded in, went across the sky for a few seconds and then faded out. And I didn't do anything for another couple of weeks and had no intention of really. I had a few things that I needed to get sorted out in my life, and was quite happy to do that. This particular night, 2 weeks later, end of August, beginning of September, yeah, because of my background. It's an incredibly frustrating thing to say. I just knew I had to go outside. There's no other...
Do you mean like a sort of impulse, as if you were being called?
Yeah, I was sat at my desk fairly late at night, between the hours of 11 and 12, just on the computer, not doing anything particularly interesting. And it was just such an overwhelming urge to go outside. No voices, no sort of voice saying, we're here. Yeah, just a very strong impulse. And it was disconcerting because I'd put so much effort into the first couple of sightings. I thought I'd taken it a bit too far, and I genuinely thought I was going a bit bonkers. And I was constantly analysing myself and analysing the situation throughout all these experiences. So eventually I got outside, and I was a little bit heartbroken not to see a galactic welcome party stood on the lawn. It was that powerful an urge. But I got outside and started communicating, and I saw the bog standard nighttime traffic, started communicating and talking to the stars, as I had done the other nights, and
with nothing being there at all.
Nothing being there at this point, no. And again, I saw all the relevant nighttime traffic, lights, and associated aircraft noise. And every time that I'd had these experiences, I was in my back garden. So I had back garden, house, road, and houses on the other side of the street. So I could just see the rooftops of the houses on the other side of the street. About 6 or 7 minutes into it, I saw a red and a green light over the rooftops for about 10 feet max above the roofline. But because I was looking for something unusual, and for all intents and purposes, that looked exactly like aircraft navigation lights, sort of blinking fairly, so I didn't pay any attention to it, and I carried on looking around and looked back at it, and it was coming a little bit closer. Thought, carried on looking around a little bit closer. After several scans and glances, something wasn't right, and I couldn't stop looking at this thing. And I couldn't see the aircraft in between the lights. But at this point, because of the red and the green light, it still looked like aircraft lights, and I'm still willing to believe.
At what point are we at sort of a few seconds into this sighting?
About 3 minutes to make its way from the point where it was over the garden. And it just hit me like a ton of bricks between the hours of 11, 12 at night. There was no traffic on the roads, no people, no wind. It was completely silent. If it had been a light aircraft, I would have heard the damn thing before I'd seen it. If it had been a light aircraft, it had no business being 10 feet above the rooftops of people's houses at that hour at the night. And it would have been and gone in several seconds, and it would have made a god-awful noise. but it was completely silent, and it was getting closer and closer and closer. Eventually it moved over the threshold of the back garden, at which point it completely changed, and there was a disc in the middle of the red and the green light, so very, very dark metallic disc. Surprisingly small.
So relative to you, what distance would it be from you at this point?
Probably about 40 feet horizontal, not very far at all, and again 10, 12 feet above the top of my house, which is a regular house, 2 stories and an attic, so very, very, very low down. Very obvious. Dark metallic disc, and whereas there had been a red and a green light, there were several more balls of light around it, distinct from the disc.
Did they sort of suddenly seem to appear?
Kind of difficult to explain that one, because as it came closer I was still sort of convinced that it was an aircraft, and as it moved over the threshold of the garden, this disc was just there and the lights were there. There was a red light or lens on the front of it with blue lights, one going anti-clockwise, one going clockwise, sort of going around and meeting, and the lights were themselves sort of blinking fairly erratically, but regular, like aircraft navigation, like all sort of, you know, doing this all over the place. Up until that point I was terrified, because I didn't know, you know, either way. I couldn't sort of pin it down. As soon as realisation kicks in, it's the best feeling ever. And I was I was thanking the thing to high heaven. I was so grateful for the experience, and it stayed with me for several minutes, just moving over the garden, painfully slow, inches across the sky, and it was tilted at a point, so, you know, I'm stood like this, and it was as focused on.
Alrighty. So here you are. So there was no beam.
No lights radiating from it. No, everything was very distinct and very crisp.
And these spheres around it, you've got them in different colours. Were they in different colours?
Yeah, they were in different colours.
It looks quite big in relation to the craft as well, doesn't it? The light, if that's sort of proportionally as it was for you.
Yeah.
Interesting. That might be.
That was kind of surprising to me, because, you know, I would have thought that
your familiarity of craft.
It would have been a lot bigger, especially with occupants inside. So I guess if there was an occupant inside, it only had a capacity of 1, or it could have been a probe.
Did you get any feeling or sensation or effect from it at all?
No, I was just incredibly excited to see it. It was a very euphoric experience. It was a lovely experience. You know, I couldn't stop looking at the thing. It was amazing. But it stayed with me for several minutes, and then when it moved over the threshold of the back garden, all the lights disappeared, and whereas it had been a crystal clear, lovely night sky, the thing became enveloped in mist, and it didn't shoot off in the sky. It just carried on, sort of going down the line of houses.
The street.
I was like, right, that's it. This is kind of, I might not have all the details down on how reality works, but this is how that seems to work, and this is how you communicate with ET civilization. This was all on my own.
So have you had any then where you've had friends with you or other people with you have seen them?
Well, it was that experience where it was so in your face and it was so obvious, and it wasn't man-made, and if it was man-made, it was a hell of a coincidence. I was so convinced by that I went and told my friend the next day, and I love her to bits, but she was lovely. She's like, brilliant, let's go and do it. And I told her,
do a sky watch.
Yeah, do a sky watch, and I told her how I thought the process worked, and we went out the first night, but it was very windy, and we didn't particularly want to stay out too long. However, we went out the second night, and we sat down by Green Hill Pier, which is a little pier by a little sort of children's paddling pool on the left-hand side, so we could see the Red Cliff and Lulworth going off in the distance, and we both started communicating, and we were saying our own different thing, and
sort of independently of each other.
Yeah. I mean, she told me what she was saying later, and she was saying, you know, she was just sending out love. She's full of love. And we saw what we thought was a light aircraft, sort of a couple of miles out over the cliffs. And from that distance, you wouldn't have been able to hear it anyway, so it looked like a light aircraft. As soon as we both were focused on it, and we were both talking about it to each other, the little lights disappeared, and it turned into an orange ball of light. And it was travelling north, which got a little bit bigger, a little bit bigger, a little bit bigger, same sort of pace, wasn't changing speed. And it stopped, and it swelled up to something about the size of the sun in the night sky. Huge. I mean,
Yeah.
I'd love to find out if anyone else saw it. It wasn't.
So when would this be?
Probably
Last year?
talking about middle of September.
I mean, because that's really large, the size of
Yeah.
of the day's sun, isn't
Yeah,
it? I mean,
no, huge. Nothing in the echo the next day. From that distance, we wouldn't have been able to hear it, and
Oh.
it swelled up to this enormous size. And then there was a brief flicker of an increase in volume, and then a sudden implosion, and it shot off in the other direction at several thousand miles an hour. Actually, just thinking about it now, the craft that I'd seen previously had the appearance of an aircraft with the navigation lights. It may well have been the same one, displaying a characteristic it didn't the first time. It was lovely for me because there was someone else that saw it. So I was like, right, I'm not just seeing these things. And I grilled her for days. I was like, did you see this? And she's like, yes, saw it.
let's do it.
That whole
communing.
experience lasted a few minutes, probably about 5 minutes, because we initially saw it sort of travelling north along the cliffs, and then it changed and it was still going along with the same pace. Swelled up, brief flicker of increase in volume, implosion, then it shot off in the other direction, with the same appearance that it initially had.
Where are you guys on this one?
We're probably sort of
Oh, you're
out of the page, and we initially saw it. I mean, that's probably a little bit of a... It was probably a little bit smaller than that, but that's just to give you the idea of
Yeah.
the lights that we initially saw, travelling north in that direction, and then it changed to a little ball of orange light, which again got bigger and bigger and bigger, swelled up, brief flicker of increase in volume, implosion, and then it shot off in the other direction.
Yeah.
The last craft that I saw was a little bit disconcerting because I hadn't instigated it, and there was no... This was, again, over the same period of time when I'd gone to my friend's house for just a chill evening, and he fancied a cup of tea. So I said, oh, well, I've got milk in the back of the car, so I'll go get some milk. And he lives in a cul-de-sac, so I went out to the car, and immediately I saw something over a house on the other side of the street, which was unusual because it shouldn't have been there. And the reason I say that is because when you look at the night sky, stars are all different, but there are occasionally stars that sort of change all manner of colours and very, very beautiful, and you might think it's a little bit strange, but it's just the spectrum of light and the elements interacting with atmosphere and magnetosphere and doing wonderful things. Looks lovely, but you know, not particularly interesting. But it was over some guy's house. So I was like, well,
So you'd be
70 to 80 feet away at this
so
point.
quite nearby again.
Yeah.
So you would see if it was obvious or not.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it was sort of pulsing gently, and just a little
At
ball
that
of
point.
sort of multicoloured light. But I wanted to see what it was, so I ran back into my mate's house and said, have you got any binoculars? And he said, no, I haven't got any binoculars. What are you looking at now? I said, oh, don't worry about it. So I pegged it over to this guy's house and knocked on his door, bearing in mind it's 11:30 at night.
Did you know him?
I had no idea
No,
who this.
strange.
And he wasn't happy to see me. Really sorry to bother you. There's something really unusual above your house. Do you have any binoculars so I can look? It's just sort of like, what are you doing? Are you on anything? I was like, no, and slammed the door.
Oh, we didn't even go and look.
No.
Was this thing still there at this time?
No. When that conversation ended, it had gone from this house and moved over to another house on the other side of the street. So I ran over to this house and knocked on the door, and fortunately a very nice older gentleman came out, and he had looked around for binoculars but couldn't find any, but he came out in his dressing gown, and we were both looking at this thing. He was like, oh, that's lovely.
So he was seeing it
Yeah,
just
no,
as you were.
no, he was seeing it, and we were both looking at it. He was like, oh, that's really cool. Probably about the size of a beach ball, maybe a little bit smaller than that, between a football and a beach ball. Very low down, literally 10, 12 feet above this guy's house. And he eventually went inside because it was 11:30 at night and it's quite cold, and he was in his dressing gown. And I started communicating, and literally instantly, matter of seconds, this thing disappeared, and in its place this enormous white craft. Best way to describe it is a huge upside down jelly bean, sort of this kind of shape with two sort of ends coming like this. Just appeared. There was no materialisation. It was as if someone had clicked a torch on, just gone click. It was there for a few seconds,
And so
then
you said it was huge.
about the same size as the guy's house, above
Wow,
his house.
okay.
Just click, there for a few seconds, and then I mean that's kind of what the little initial object looked like beforehand.
So it's weenie
Yeah.
beside that, isn't it?
Completely silent,
completely
no noise
silent.
associated, no beams of light coming towards it, so it wasn't a projection. It was
And no kind of telepathic
No.
communication going on?
No.
Nothing going on. So this thing sort of suddenly blip into view, white light or outline?
A very, very crisp, very distinct outline, very distinct shape, brilliant white. It was as if someone had got that shape stamp and just stamped it out of space and time. This thing was just there, and then it just appeared for a few seconds and then disappeared. When it appeared, it was shock. It was like blood, because it was the biggest thing I'd seen, size-wise.
Close quarters?
Yeah, very, very close quarters. I mean, the craft that was over my garden for several minutes was significantly smaller than that. I mean, this thing was enormous by comparison.
Got the milk?
Got the milk. Yeah, well earned. Cup of tea. Because by then I was well aware that the principal form of communication was consciousness. That's how it works. The point is, you know, if you want to see these things, all you have to do is ask nicely. At the same time, that was the last major craft experience. At the same time, I was looking into remote viewing, because that seemed to be an avenue or way of seeing these things first and then calling them in. But having never had anyone show me how to do it, I didn't know how to do it, and I was, you know, I'd be lying in my bed at night and trying to get myself into a nice calm state so I could see something. I'd ask questions in my mind and I'd hear answers, but I couldn't distinguish. I had no way of telling whether that was me or them. And because of these experiences that I was having, it got a bit too much, and I went out a few nights later and said, thank you so much for these experiences, they've been amazing, but I'd need a break. Yeah, and that was the last major craft experience.
So that was last year?
That was last year, that was September.
Because it didn't all finish last year, did it? We've
No.
still got something to report this year.
The experiences that I've had this year have been difficult to understand. The experiences in 2010 were with craft, and they appeared, you know, that I can conclude they appeared because I'd asked them to. But that whole journey had started because of the experiences that I'd had in January, which I hadn't asked for, and even though they weren't frightening, it was very different and very completely out of the ordinary. Over the course of the year, I assume because I'd been released from my body or taken out of my body, and my body wasn't used to it. At this, you know, it's just speculation at this point, but I was having every, say, few weeks, I'd find myself floating out of my body, and I didn't particularly associate that with ET, just out of body experience. Yeah. All I wanted to do was sleep. So I'd sort of focus myself back into my body and you know, get back to sleep. But every time it happened, I'd get more frustrated that it was happening, and at the beginning of this year, I found it happening again, and all the lights were off in my bedroom, but there was enough light coming in for me to see the details of my room, and I could see my mug of tea that I'd left there, and I was so, pardon my French, pissed off by this point. I thought, right, I'm going to go tell Dad. I need to talk to Dad. So I thought the best decision, and it seemed completely the right thing to do, was to walk out of my bedroom and go and knock on my Dad's door. I knew I was out of my body, but, you know, I just assumed he would answer and be like, well, that's all right, go back to bed. So I walked through my door and out into a little cubby hole alcove bit outside my bedroom, at which point a being came from nowhere, and it was very apparent that it had a gait. It had been rushing from somewhere. It had a hell of a stride to it. Typical grey, very slender, very long arms, long fingers, a little bit taller than I was. It was a shock. Basically, by this point, I'd got so fed up with these out-of-body experiences that I thought the most sensible thing to do would be to go and tell my dad about it, and he usually sorts everything out. So I walked through my door. You know, I knew that I was awake. I knew it was an out-of-body experience. So, you know, I was not sleeping, and it was not a dream state. I walked through the door into a little alcove outside my bedroom. As I got there, a being, a typical grey, slightly taller than me, just appeared into space-time. It was almost as if there was a portal that I couldn't see, and it had been walking through it. It had been rushing from somewhere, as if something wasn't quite right. And it put its hands on my shoulders, and, you know, as I said in the beginning, I still don't know what the astral body is, but that's where it put its hands. Completely tangible, it was very real, and it pushed me against the door, and its eyes were narrowed, as if to suggest concern. there were no thoughts. It was a very cold experience, very clinical.
And was it a shock for you to feel yourself being pushed against a wall?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. The difference with this particular out-of-body experience and ET interaction was, whereas the first ones there'd be no emotion and I wasn't frightened, this one was such a shock because the first time round I'd only managed to see half of the head when I'd sit, and that's when the experience ended. This time round it was a grey standing in front of me, full sort of, you know, very slim, black suit. But yeah, skin tight, all in one. Perhaps with a belt, but I didn't look that far down. I was just looking at this thing coming towards me, and it put its hand on my shoulders and just...
Was it at your height?
Just slightly taller, maybe a couple of inches taller. Put its hand on my shoulders and pushed me against the door, and its face came right up to mine.
So how tall are you?
Between 5'6", 5'7".
Yes.
And it was such a shocking experience that I wouldn't say I was frightened, but I was definitely very concerned, and I didn't want this to happen. And I do remember saying, I really don't want to go this time. I don't want to go again. Please, just stop it. You know, it wasn't like stop it with fear. It was just, for God's sake, stop this. And I pushed my hand against its face, and I remember my fingers sort of going inside its mouth and pushing its lip up.
So when you did that, you made contact. Again, it felt physical, so you're making contact with the left or right side of its face?
Which way? Oh, right hand pushing up its right lip, push. I was aware that there was something in the mouth, gum, teeth, whatever. I didn't push my fingers all the way, stopped it.
Connected.
I mean, my fingers slid, touched something and slid against the inside of its mouth, which was why its lip got pushed up.
How did it feel?
That wasn't a particularly remarkable memory. I just remember that it was very tangible, and I pushed fingers inside its mouth. The thing that stands out in terms of senses as well as touch and seeing the thing was the smell. It was very clinically biological, and at best comparison I can draw, which is a very strange comparison, but it's exactly what it smelled like, is being next to an elderly patient in a hospital
because
ward.
a lot of people describe sort of sulphuric kind of smells, ammonia, and I don't know whether that even fits in. I can't quite bring that kind of hospital smell to mind, apart from the obvious disinfectant kind of smell.
The funny thing is, I could probably draw that comparison because my parents owned a few residential homes when I was, from when I was born, so I spent a lot of time around the elderly, so that's the closest comparison I can make there.
That's really interesting.
It was a very, very disconcerting experience. And
did you feel threatened?
I felt completely not in control. I knew that something wasn't right. I didn't feel in danger. I didn't feel like this was the end of my life or anything like this, or that something terrible was going to happen. Just an overwhelming sense of concern. And its eyes were very narrowed, and it was staring into me like it was reading me. But it was... best that I can sort of conclude from that is that I shouldn't have wandered that far away from my body. They were kind of, or he, she, whoever it was just making sure that I didn't do it again, because I wasn't supposed to do that. Is
that the message that you got? You're not supposed to be doing that for you?
It's the conclusion that I can draw from the evidence that was there, that it wasn't a cruel experience. I remember telling a couple of cousins of mine in Mauritius about it, and when I told them, I actually said that it was a very loving experience, but that was only because I was so concerned by the experience in itself that I had to make myself feel better about it.
Okay.
That was a couple of weeks before I went to Mauritius. Well, my intention was to go and talk to my dad, to go and tell him that I was fed up with this and I needed it sorting out. Can you help me, please? Who knows what my dad would have seen had I actually achieved that. And I think the point of it was just to make sure that I didn't.
So stopped you in your tracks,
Stopped me in my tracks and just held me against the door. The frightening part about it was, obviously, I wasn't in control, but this thing was so close.
I mean, did you push it, or did you just make contact?
It was pushing its face away from me because it was so close, and I didn't want it. It didn't really have any effect. It still held its hands on its
ground.
It definitely held its ground. It was there to do a job. It didn't seem to perturb it too much. It just kept holding me there and looking at me and looking into me.
And how did that event resolve?
It turned around and just went back the way it came.
So did you maintain your hand on its face?
I kept pushing it away, but it had strength to it. After a couple of minutes, it backed up, turned around and back the way it came, and I walked back into my room and settled down into my body. There was no wishing this time. It was just like, I kind of guess I just have to go back into my body. It was upsetting because of the experiences that I'd had last year. I'd asked for contact and I'd had my requests granted. And when I said it was all too much, even though I did go out a few nights after that, nothing appeared and they sort of respected my wishes. It was upsetting because I hadn't asked for that to happen, but it might have been my own fault.
Let's go on to your holiday. I believe you had a holiday with your mum and dad in your lovely second home of Mauritius.
Mauritius.
And something happened there.
Yeah. Well, after all of this and after that experience, it was just too much. And I could not stop thinking about it. It was impossible to go through a minute in the day without thinking about it. So, one of the things I wanted to do when I got to Mauritius was to just clear my mind and forget about everything. And even just being there for the first few days didn't help. I had to make a conscious effort to really focus on not thinking about it. I had told my mum about these things and she was very nice about it. She said I believe you saw them, which was fine for me. I didn't want to sort of scare her.
And did Dad have a similar attitude?
Dad's attitude was, and I completely respect it. I love my dad to bits. He means the world to me. Well, they both do. I think it's too much for him to contemplate that his son is going through that kind of thing. And they're both psychiatric nurses. Dad certainly has training in that, and Mum was trained in that way now. She's an A&E nurse. Their immediate sort of conclusions would be based on their training. Dad would sort of put it down to psychosis or stress or this, that and the other, which I can absolutely tell you that it wasn't, especially the craft. People seeing, my friends seeing the craft and on this occasion. So I told my mum about these experiences and I said to her, do you fancy going down to the beach and trying contact? She's like, no thanks. I was like, fair enough. But a couple of weeks in, we were there for 4.5 weeks. I was in bed, everything had been fine up until then, and then I found myself coming out of my body, but it wasn't a regular out of body. Well, I say regular is in the ones that I've been having over the year. I knew that for a brief second that I wasn't where I wasn't in my bedroom for a few seconds. Where I was, I have no idea. But I was furious. I was so angry because I'd tried so hard to forget about it. And that was throughout all these experiences, because I've done my research and I've read other people's accounts. I've never had any voices in my head or anything like this up until that point where whoever it was said, we didn't mean to do that. And it was very apologetic over like that. I didn't have to put myself back into my body, I just woke up.
So it sounds like then the out-of-body experiences that you've been having have been sort of engineered.
I would say that's the safest bet. My view on it is some of them certainly have been. The first couple obviously were, well, to me they were absolutely, engineered. Others, something might have gone wrong in the process. I'm flying out my body and I'm not supposed to be, which is why I have to force myself back in. And it's a very almost painful experience because it's so intense. It's very high frequency vibrational buzzing. It's like an electric shock. That was the only one where I felt apology and love, that they were genuinely sorry and they didn't mean that one to happen, or they didn't mean it to go that way, which is kind of worrying because it means that there probably have been a lot more that I don't know about. And
it's interesting because you've got to wonder what they were doing that would cause that response to happen in you by accident.
Yeah.
Whether they just scoop a whole load of people up in one go and oops, we forgot we didn't, not that one tonight.
Yeah, rota.
Just before we continue with Resh's story of being on the beach in Mauritius, this is a little depiction of the chap in a black coverall who had him pinned against the wall. So there we go. Lovely Mauritius beach.
Lovely Mauritius beach. It was the last night of the holiday and I'd been infrequently pestering Mum to go down to the beach and try communicating with me, to which she politely declined. But on the last night we were walking back and just before we took the turning to go into our apartments, literally right above us, this lovely little red ball of light appeared, and it had 5 very distinct strands of yellow light, one off the top, it sort of, but 5 points, equally spaced, very distinct, and this thing appeared in front of us completely silently, about 70 to 80 feet above us, so not very high at all. And as it did so, it was going away from us. And it stretched out slightly and then just shot off over the horizon. All throughout these experiences, especially the ones in August and September, if I can dismiss it, if I can identify it, I'll dismiss it. Because, I was looking for conclusive proof. And if I describe that to anyone, they'll probably say, oh, it was a meteorite. That was far bigger than any meteorite I'd seen the previous year.
From where you were standing there, what sort of size, more or less, could you give it?
If it's about 70 to 80 feet in the air, then probably about 3 or 4 times the size of average beach ball.
A fair size.
Fair size, and bearing in mind it was completely silent. Yep, it just popped above our heads. It hadn't been coming from in front of us and then stretched and shot off. I do have a little picture of it here. So if we're looking at it like this, it's going away from us, and it's sort of about 70 or 80 feet in the sky, about that size. But because it was going away from us, if you were to look at it side on, it would have that kind of look to it. Yeah. But I've never seen any meteorite or comet like that, and I've looked for photos and pictures, and I can't find anything that fits that description. I mean, these things were stuck on the side. It was...
So did it look like they were actually part of the craft rather than a light streak?
Oh yeah, it definitely looked as if it was part of the...
Well, that's intriguing. I haven't seen anything like that either. And these were yellow and the ball was red. But this would have been quite big. If this had been on the ground, it would have been quite a size, wouldn't it?
Oh yeah, you would have been able to climb into it. April, March of...
This year.
Yeah. I've had a couple of experiences since then. One being I was taken out of my body again. This was quite recently. This was certainly within the last couple of months. I can't pin it down because I was doing a hell of a lot of other stuff, and it wasn't what I was focusing on anyway. The thing with out-of-body experiences is you know you're awake and you know you're out of your body. It's not a dream state. And I woke up and I found myself barreling across the floor and out of the bedroom wall and outside, and there was a very distinct sensation of warmth in the bedroom and cold outside, and I can't remember anything else. With the first couple of experiences last January, the second time, there is a very brief recollection of lights and not being in my bedroom, but like I said, nothing that I would take into a court of law, so I don't have any memory of being aboard a craft or anything like that, which actually at the moment I'm quite grateful for.
Yeah. Are you the first person or the only person in your family to have had something?
As far as I know.
So your mum, now how did she feel about what she'd seen?
For Mum's sake, I told her what I thought it was, and then that it probably was a comment, and she said, well, it was very cool, whatever it was. But the reason I said that to her was a few months before Mauritius, we were out in the garden, someone had set off a Chinese lantern. And I told Mum about these experiences that I'd had, and she sort of immediately made the connection, and she got very frightened, and I did feel sorry for her because I played it up a bit and said, well, they're here just checking things out, but I knew it was a Chinese lantern. It's Mum's choice. One of the things she said is, well, whether or not all of this is true, and we've been talking about things like 9/11, and
does lead you down a lot of rabbit holes, doesn't it? This
she just doesn't want to know at a point in her life, which is fine, and I love her to bits. She's such a sweetheart, so I don't want to cause her any grief. But she saw it and she thought it was very cool.
Did she tell your dad?
Probably not. Well, the best response was my friend who came out with me and saw craft over the Lulworth Cliffs. But it's varied. The past 2 years have been different in every way to the previous 24 years of my life, and I've felt compelled to tell people. So I have told friends. Some of them are very interested and they listen, and that they think it's feasible and they make of it what they want to. And there've been a couple that have just basically said, what have you been taking? And I haven't talked to them since about it. But generally it's been a fairly positive response. But one of the things that I wanted to do, but I don't know when I will, is to go out and do it again with a group of people. So
just to round off, Resh, and thanks very much, it's been really fascinating. Tell me what you think, perhaps going back to your 5 questions, have you got some answers?
All throughout this process, I've been trying to get a general picture of what's going on. The thing that I found hardest when researching this subject is that there are so many different avenues, and there are so many different avenues that for me, as a person that likes, in spite of my experiences, proof and empiricism and cold hard facts, or a hell of a weight behind a point for it to be believable. There are a lot of avenues which don't have enough evidence to seem feasible at this point. I'm sure that those people that have had those experiences have had these experiences, and they do their own research and come up with their own conclusions. They may be right, but for me at this point I don't know. But in terms of the picture that I've found so far, the ET issue is very real. We are not alone. We never have been alone, and we never will be.
What do you think is one of the most important, perhaps, questions or issues to come out of that knowledge alone, that we are not alone, and that there is something that is able to manipulate the dimensions that we're in? There
are a few key points which, in terms of what I've been able to put together, do fit the picture and are of genuine concern, and which is why I sympathise with some of the actions of the agencies in keeping it secret for so long, it's going to have a huge impact on society when it does officially come out. There's a hybrid project, and that our history as we know it is not just our own. It's very hard for me to believe outright other people's abduction experiences. I'm sticking to my own experiences as I see it. But this particular bloke woke up one morning to find himself being straddled by a naked woman who was obviously human in form, but there was something about her face that was a little bit less human-like, and there was another lady sat on the edge of his bed. It was a particularly traumatic experience for him, and she brought him up to her breast and he bit her. Interesting thing about that for me is he was obviously trying to mate with him for whatever reason, but there was DNA evidence left behind, which was
in a hair
that he found around his penis. With that piece of evidence, I mean, the university faculties jumped on it and relevant scientific boards jumped on it, and the conclusion that they came to was that it's human in a sense, but related to an extremely rare strain of human, but that the more likely case would be that it was not from Earth. I can't wait for this all to come out.
Do you think it might in your lifetime?
I have high hope, but I think when it does, it is, you know, and I do say to everyone that there's a lot to get your head around. You know, in a sense, completely new to this. I was literally taken out of one paradigm and thrown headfirst into another, and had to deal with it and had to focus and understand it. I think my only role that I've been able to determine is that I have to tell people. I had so much success on my own, and when I went to see if anyone else had had that much success on their own, I couldn't find anyone, which was a little bit worrying in itself, but kind of did feel a little bit of responsibility there. I was looking for a place or an organisation in the UK to talk to about these things, because there really isn't one of worth that found, you know, so I'm very, very grateful. Thank you.
Well, thank you for sharing your story, and this has been Ammach, another interview.